welcome to Love Books. It's really so lovely to have so many people here tonight. Thank you for coming and for squashing into the shop. We are, of course, launching this very special book, the African Art, the Arak collection. And I'm sure that this is going to be an equally special evening tonight with this incredible panel that Stacey Hardy has put together for us. So first up, a huge thank you to Stacey for approaching us in the first place to hold this launch and for pulling everything together. If you don't know Stacey, and I think you all do, she's a writer and she's a lecturer in creative writing at the School of Literature, Language and Media at Wits University. And she will be moderating this evening's conversation. Thanks are also due to the fabulous publicity and sales teams at Jonathan Ball, some of whom are here tonight, and that's really lovely to have all of you here. Jonathan Ball are the local distributors for Skira, who are the publishers of African art. And as always, they are incredibly supportive and they just make things easy for us here on the retail side. And now to our guests. First up is Ashraf Jamal, who is, of course, the author of the book. It's wonderful to have you here tonight, Ashraf. Thank you and welcome. Ashraf is widely regarded as one of Africa's foremost art writers and thinkers. He is the writer-researcher for Art Bank South Africa and a research associate at the Art and Design Research Centre at the University of Johannesburg. He has studied in the UK, Canada, the US, and taught in universities in South Africa, Malaysia, and the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. He's the former editor of Art South Africa and Art Africa, and he's the author of a number of books, including Strange Cargo, which is a brilliant collection of art essays. Ashraf, thanks for the enormous contribution you've made to art in Africa, and as I said, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. And then a welcome to Professor Jeanne-Marie Jackson, who is a visiting scholar of comparative and African literatures, and she's all the way from Johns Hopkins University in the United States. She works across English, Russian, Afrikaans, and actually when she arrived this afternoon, she was speaking Afrikaans. Shona and Fante literature and intellectual traditions, and she says she is always glad to hear from other unorthodox comparatists. In addition to her main field of African literature, she has published on novel theory, literature and philosophy, comparative method, and Russian realism. In fact, she's published a book called South African Literature's Russian Soul, which I'm afraid we don't have. But if anyone's interested in ordering that, please leave your name. I'm sure we can track it down for you. We do have one of her books, which is called The African Novel of Ideas. Jeanne-Marie, it's lovely to have you here tonight. Thank you so much. And while I'm on Jeanne-Marie, you might have noticed that we have delicious snacks for you tonight, which we don't normally have at launches. And that is thank you to Jeanne-Marie and Johns Hopkins University, who have sponsored the wine and the snacks tonight. So thank you for that very important thing. Over to all of you.
I know that in South Africa there's no more important budget item than the wine.
Yeah. There we go, Ashraf.
Oh, thank you.
Got it. An enormous thank you to everybody for coming out here tonight on this cold night and squashing in here with us. I'm thrilled to be surrounded by two very brilliant writers. Just as by way of my own introduction, I first encountered Ashraf when I moved to Cape Town, I think sometime in the early 2000s, or the first half of the 2000s at least. And everybody who I met said to me, I'm so-and-so, but actually I'm this character in Ashraf's book, which was his first novel that he published. And I first knew. One of the things one might ask is why, as creative writing, am I chairing this panel on literature and art? And I first got to know Ashraf as a creative writer. I hunted down the novel that everybody claimed to be in. And he remains one of my favorite fiction writers, and I think one of our great unsung fiction writers in this country, and I'm keeping on trying to persuade him to go back to that at some point in his life. And I apparently, although I don't remember it, I must confess, have also met Jeanne-Marie in Ashraf's kitchen in Cape Town during that same era. So we actually all go way back. And I said to her that I have a bad habit of judging people by their literature, taste in literature. I'm somebody who's always going straight to somebody's shelf and then, deciding whether I want to be friends with them or not. And looking at the work you've covered in all your books, I would like to be friends. I would like to keep, I've got some very quite formal, and I'm sitting here with my piece of paper, questions that I want to ask. But I think it's just also because the density and the beauty of the work, and I'm really trying to, I think, get into that and dig into that. But I'd love to keep tonight informal and flexible and chatty, as you want. How we'll work is I'm going to ask everybody, each of the two readers, to read something from their work. It is Ashraf's book launch, but we would also love Jeanne-Marie to read, just so that you can hear, I think, what is the beauty of the writing, because these are both two people who are very brilliant thinkers, but also extraordinary writers. And I think it's important to hear some of the work. So shall we start with Ashraf and then Jeanne-Marie? If you'll read something for us.
Okay. I'm going to read the conclusion. I had a much darker passage that I planned, but I thought it's cold, it's cozy, and we need something a lot more pleasant and more optimistic. So I'm going to read a little bit in the last page. As the historian, the Swiss historian Andre Gunder Frank prophetically noted, we are in dire need of an alternative perspective of the world for the new world disorder in the making. He said this in the 1990s in his book on the Asian economy. How one thwarts fatalism, the death instinct at the root of global politics, and holds fast to a fundamental goodness will determine the outcome. The art world, deemed superfluous to human fate, is in fact a vital dimension of its health. This is John Armstrong and Alain de Botton's view. However, they remain skeptical regarding its disproportionate and exclusionary inflation, opting instead for a world where art is less necessary and less exceptional, a world where the rules currently found, celebrated and fetishized in concentrated doses in the cloistered halls of museums, are scattered more promiscuously across the earth. The true aspiration of art should be to reduce the need for it. Yes, art should be more democratically embraced. Yes, it need not appear in museums to be considered valuable. But to suppose its indiscriminate and promiscuous global efflorescence to be its better fate? In short, museums matter. Furthermore, they are undergoing seismic changes, sometimes reticently, sometimes genuinely. In this regard, those excluded from the art canon are being integrated, and a new world history in a new world disorder is in the making. It is in this greater context that this wager regarding a need for African art is positioned. Then again, perhaps need is an overstated presumption. Surely a productive compassion is better, or a more generous inclusivity. An African art collection as fecklessly wide-ranging, crudely summed up under the controversial moniker sub-Saharan art, signals a transnational and diasporic sensibility, Africa in the greater world, and as such, a worldview that necessarily understands interpenetration and hybridity as constitutive. The continent of Africa, after all, is profoundly informed by maritime and terrestrial travel. No place is ever hermetic. Nothing is truly closed. Indeed, as the maritime historian Fernand Braudel reminds us, no civilization can survive without mobility. All are enriched by trade and the stimulating impact of strangers. The American ethnographer James Clifford concurs, noting that the world's societies are too systematically interconnected to permit any easy isolation of separate or independently functioning systems. It follows that African life and art partakes directly of the flows of globalization. The key question is whether that flow is still asymmetrical, privative, or extractive, whether a reunification of a global imaginary is truly possible. As a Danish colleague, actually an equestrian, based in Kenya, remarked, it is African art that is being mined today. However, The rediscovery of the ancient port of Berenike on the Red Sea in Egypt's eastern desert, the furthest outpost of the Roman Empire, is a sobering reminder of global connectivity and cosmopolitanism. As Joe Marchant notes, archaeologists have uncovered mounds of administrative detritus, including letters, receipts, and customs passes, and imported treasures such as ivory, incense, textiles, gems, and foodstuffs such as pots of Indian peppercorns, coconuts, and rice that serve as proof of a vast oceanic trade. Furthermore, belief systems have also been discovered to be hybrid and tricontinental in influence. In some ways, it was a wild frontier at the edge of an empire, but it was also the center of something much bigger, a beating heart that drove the makings of the modern world. This view is critical. It underscores a rethinking of global history in which differences override exclusion and the interface of cultures becomes definitional. To understand Africa's place in this new world disorder in the making is a start. This book on its sub-Saharan artists introduces the reader to names both known and unknown, artists celebrated at the local level, but often unheeded on the global, whose worlds are too often forgotten or disregarded. If books are reliquaries, then perhaps this book contains a greater possibility, perhaps even a rendezvous. As the Martinican poet and celebrated figure of the African diaspora, Aimé Césaire, wrote in his notebook of a return to my native land, "It is not true that the work of man is finished, that we have nothing more to do in the world, that we are just parasites in this world, that it is enough for us to walk in step with the world. For the work of man is only just beginning, and it remains to conquer all. The violence entrenched in the recess of his passion, and no race holds a monopoly of beauty, of intelligence, of strength, and there is a place for all at the rendezvous of victory." Thank you.
I, unlike Ashraf, do everything on my phone, and my service is very slow. And I was wondering if Freddie would be so kind as to grab me a hard copy of my book. Perfect. Never mind. Got it. Let's just use the microphone. Oh, it's Ashraf's copy.
Please request to use a mic just because of the recording.
Absolutely. So I selected two very short passages, one which is the academic prose, although I try not to be too egregious an offender on that front, and the other, which is a little bit more personal and explains some of the origins of the book. The African novel of ideas shares the goal of peeling away the sticky associational layers that have accreted to the notion of individualism in post-colonial, globalist, literary, and theoretical debates. If the book has a grand claim, it is that African intellectual traditions are rich in work where a separate space for the thinker corresponds to a separate space for the thought, where ideas, that is, are granted a force and even, sorry Lucy, ontology of their own by a turn to narrative designs that advance individual integrity as against the more common porosity or dissolution. As Justin Smith notes in his own book, The Philosopher, A History in Six Types, defining a philosophical practice depends basically on characterizing those who do it. Philosophy, he writes, is often held to be the activity that is concerned with universal truths, to be discovered by a priori reflection, rather than with particular truths, which are to be discovered by empirical means. This is an especially apt summary in this book's present fictive frame. To call something a novel of ideas is to contemplate the figures in novels who have ideas, their structural role and situation, how their thoughts are given narrative shape, and the realms between which they mediate, to use Smith's term, for example, between the immanent and transcendent, or the material and the ideal. Inasmuch as philosophy is performed, however, it's crucially not reducible to its embodiment. Sophie Oluwole goes so far as to declare that it's about what people say rather than what they do. While Raymond Guess writes, philosophy takes place when someone begins to try to look for a way out, which might include transforming the framework of some situation, changing the rules, asking different questions. The work on the novel in Africa and elsewhere has moved away from its once definitional emphasis on the representative individual in favor of much hotter topics like networks, ecology, and the transmission of popular genres. It remains the case that the form is particularly well suited to pivot between the embedded thinker and the abstract thought. Okay, and if you'll just bear with me, this is the second brief excerpt that is something I'd probably only write in an introduction and would definitely not give at a fancy and slightly terrifying academic conference talk. I want to pause briefly now and reflect on a particular philosophical individual who was often in my mind as I wrote this book, because I think he's revealing of these stakes and their transformation across the African 20th century. My late father-in-law, David Awatri, or Nana Ikau Ayiku I, was born in 1922 to a prominent family from the then Gold Coast town of Elmina, which I'm sure people here know. In the States, not so much. It typically requires about 10 minutes of explanation. He was a decolonial intellectual very much of his time. After completing a master's degree at the London School of Economics, he served in various government roles under Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's first prime minister and president, of course, and then also in Ghana's Second Republic. Also a Fanti chief, a revered family elder, and head of the Anona or Parrot clan, Awatri's communal bona fides are self-evident. This account is not intended as a hagiography. Awatri was without doubt subject to the blind spots shared, frankly, by most men of his time and place. I am, however, struck by the difficulty I've faced in finding any real critical language to make sense of his life, as it's been recounted to me, a life in which self-determination featured equally as richly as affiliation. He spent long hours in his study, reading voluminously from both Western and African traditions, and ultimately wrote a learned history of Elmina that affords it the depth of Fanti perspective he thought was lacking from previous efforts. Though Ghana's capital city of Accra is not known for its walkability, nor was it then. My husband tells a story of trying to walk around it and being hit by a car on his first attempt. That didn't go great. Awatri would rise each morning before dawn to stroll briskly around his busy neighborhood of Osu. Such reflective discipline and self-boundedness, and the tradition, I'd say, of the first African novel ever published in English, J.E. Casely Hayford's Ethiopia Unbound, was a key part of his civic leadership model. One might say, after Frederick Gross, that walking was, for my father-in-law, an act by which the body's monotonous duty liberates thought. It is then that thoughts can arise, surface, or take shape. Just one last brief moment. These words from Gross's A Philosophy of Walking, as it were, describe Immanuel Kant and his iconic daily perambulations around Königsberg. It's an obvious point of comparison with the glimpse of Awatri's life offered here, revealing in its similarities and differences alike. The cliché of Kant's walks is of almost hermetic containment, neither marrying nor ever leaving the small Prussian city in which he was born. He becomes an emblem either of dogged commitment to the pursuit of a priori truths, the good version of Kant, or much more commonly now, and in the fields that I work in, of flawed Enlightenment notions of truth's extrication from social meaning and consequence. Awatri's life, on the other hand, was cosmopolitan in every sense. He saw no contradiction between the knowledge bequeathed by his metropolitan education and his lifelong activism on behalf of the Fanti language and culture. As a dedicated civil servant, he traveled often between Ghana and London, returning to oversee a household of many children and whatever relations, liberally defined, might be there for an extended stay. If it's easy to see how a life like Kant's would be impoverished by a lack of social accountability, it's harder to remember that a life like Awatri's, with its seemingly endless list of communal responsibilities, also entailed an abiding commitment to a Kantian ideal. Their walks thus represent two extremes of what intellectual self-sequestration asks of critical thought at our own aspirationally pluralist juncture. The first cries out for the ongoing revision of stock Enlightenment norms to accord with social interdependence, while the second calls for recognition of how essential an almost naive-seeming life of the mind might feel to someone steeped in unquestioned communal obligation. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the beautiful readings. So I think it's been very vividly enacted here. Both your books transverse disciplines. You deliberately move fluidly, reading art through philosophy, film, literature, and to that I'll, after the last extract, have to add maritime theory, archaeology, and ethnography, and reading literature through politics, history, and love. And it seems to me that this hybridity is not just methodological, but also deeply poetic. Your prose is ruminative, cerebral, at times lush, and always incisive. And in doing so, it seems to me that both your texts dare to imagine and to enact a kind of intellectual and imaginative life. What does this hybrid mode allow you to access that a more disciplined or disciplinary approach might foreclose? And do you enjoy writing as much as I enjoy reading you? And what might it mean to claim joy, insight, aesthetic pleasure as critical tools in themselves, not just indulgences, but acts of world making? I don't know who would like to go first. Ashraf, you've been nominated.
Well, to pick up on hybridity first, and to speak more personally, the book I'm writing at the moment is called, it's my memoir, and it's called International Bastard. So in many ways, the idea of hybridity is built into that concept of living in a global space between worlds. And also the key thing about it actually comes from a novel by Michael Ondaatje called The English Patient. And it's actually Kirpal Singh, the bomb disposal expert in the novel, who describes himself as the international bastard. Now, why that for me becomes an honest way to position myself is because I don't see myself defined by nationalism, by identity, whether it's sexual or racial or cultural. I try to keep things as open and as fluid as possible in the way that I navigate the world. And the same thing applies to ideas. And for me, it's got a lot to do with the fact that I suppose the time at which I inherited what one might call thought, say at the age of 16, 17, when I was at university, and basically what I was taught was the death of the author. What I was taught was Roland Barthes and the deconstructive mechanisms. So I came from a world that was very much against the idea of absolutes, and the differential became central. So for me, it helped me to understand myself, being part Basotho, part Scottish, part Gujarat. In that mix, there's a complex differentiality there as well. And then there's also, with the ethnicities, the geographical pluralities. So for me, the idea then was to knit it all together. Being born in Cape Town is important in this regard because it's a brilliant New Zealand maritime historian who basically, he's got a book called Port Cities and Intruders. And the argument is that port cities are the most dynamic spaces on the planet because that's where all the interpenetration, the multiplex of cultures and desires and all meet in those zones. So I'm from Cape Town, so it's one of those. And I'm a huge, huge fan. My favorite photographer is Billy Monk. And Billy Monk was a photographer in the Sex District in Cape Town in the 60s. Shooting in the underbelly of apartheid, where people across sexualities and races all met and got together, and he created a vitalism, which for me remains. In fact, interestingly enough, there's not a single photographer I've come across who is remotely as vital. The reason being is because the whole idea of South African aesthetics, South African being, has been basically calcified into a kind of a certain kind of ideological rigor, a certain kind of determinism that has killed a lot of the complexities of being alive. And that's got to do with sort of segmentation, separatisms, and all these things, where people in actuality don't live like that. We don't live according to those barriers. We live a much more open life. So for me, forgive me for dragging this on, but just to say in response, for me, I can't separate the mind from the body, what Nietzsche calls the physiological thought, and I cannot separate from the fact that we live perpetually in a nexus of complexities which are rich and enabling rather than distracting, controlling.
Ashraf is lying. First of all, he didn't get thought at 16. He got it at 6. I think we all know that. But good sell. I was trained in something called comparative literature. I mean, in response to your question about writing and what it means to write, I describe it to my students now in the States where I've taught and wherever I give lectures as kind of like an English PhD, but hard. Because you have to learn languages and you have to kind of go all in. So comparatists tend to have as much in common in their training with people doing the kind of much loathed, often for very good reasons, area studies, right? You have to go to the places that you're reading about and kind of get your sea legs. But it means, or rather maybe I went into it because I already had this predisposition, I am utterly, and I think probably to my own professional detriment, incapable of compartmentalizing. I simply cannot do it. Every situation that I find myself in my life, I have to figure out not just how it feels and whether it's good or bad and should keep going. I have to map the intellectual genealogy and coordinates back for hundreds of years. This is just my compulsion. I had a previous life a long time ago in South Africa, and I did it. I was unable to have a child with someone from a different part of the continent and not figure out where the hell he came from. And it becomes an extremely academic pursuit for me. I think that's weird to hear for a lot of people. Most of the time, you don't figure out your life through intense archival research. But that is how I figure out my life. And it involves a lot of bracketing. It's not primarily a sort of auto-theoretical process. It's very much not about me. But it's not compartmentalizing. And I think that those are two quite different things. For me, that ends up completely inflecting the process of writing. I've written 3 monographs and a bunch of other stuff, and every single one of them was trying to figure out the relationship between a situation and then other writers, other artists and thinkers who had deliberately tried to hold the situation a little bit at bay, who themselves tried to get what Escam Pashlela used to call a corner, where he could just go and kind of hover and figure stuff out a little bit. And so I guess the people that I tend to be drawn to writing about, the writers even who I tend to gravitate towards for short pieces, for reviews, for things like that, are people who I intuitively think are in that corner, right? Who in some way have something magnetic and compulsory even to say about their own historical situation, but who do it in a way that very purposefully just brackets, just get a little bit of distance from the vicissitudes of it. And so in that way, I think that I hope my writing kind of echoes or reflects some of the contours or ambitions of the people I write about in a way that could perhaps make it seem a little bit cold sometimes. It's not, auto theory is very, very big in the States right now. Everyone's got a memoir. People have 2, 3 memoirs. That's not what I do, right? It's like, no, I want 19th century newspaper archives, and that's how I'll come to terms with my marriage, which is true. But it is, I think, still a kind of figuring out where I stand in relation to other people.
Both of you have in many ways answered my next question, which was largely about geographies and movement. And I think you both touched on that quite comprehensively. But Jeanne-Marie, if I can just throw the mic back at you to say a little bit more about your situatedness, because you've moved from South Africa to America via Russia through Ghana, and I'm just very curious, and also maybe that's also something that Ashraf can speak to more, that these fluidities, of course, moving across systems is not just geographic, but they're also questions of institutional. They raise questions of institutional and also economic powers, especially when I think about bringing literature and art together, an art world where there is such a fluid economy, so to speak, and a literature world which seems to move at a very different kind of pace and economy. And it's something that's always kind of fascinated me between those things. So this idea of traversing geographic but also institutional and economic brackets, what do you think happens to critique when it moves across these systems? And if you can say a little bit more about your transglobal geographies and movements.
Sure. I mean, first of all, you're hitting on something essential in the difference between what Ashraf and I do. And Ashraf and I are old friends and yet think about things very differently in some ways. The art world has money, right? we all know that. Not every artist is rich, but some of them are. And there's money to be had. There's been a boom in African art and African portraiture in particular, or a bubble, because it seems to have burst earlier this year. That's gotten a lot of coverage. I've been reading articles from financial pages that people send me in various outlets. We're all broke in literature. I mean, like to different degrees for sure, but there's no money here. Not in anything that I care about. I have a rule personally, just in terms of allocating my own time and energy, which is obviously, I'm an administrator right now, so it's at a premium. I don't review books. I don't cover books from for-profit publishers, not because I don't think that there are some really good ones. I think that would be very crude. There are, but because they're going to get plenty. Like Chimamanda Adichie doesn't need another review, right? So I always ferret out what's happening on the ground at the most innovative, most ambitious small presses in the places that I've kind of attached to like a language barnacle, and continue to do that. So that's one way I think that I make sense of the places that I work in and around from my obviously American, very privileged institutional position, is that I just sort of don't play the game I'm supposed to be playing. And people can make of it what they will, right? And it also means that you can have impact in a way that you couldn't have if you were writing about purple hibiscus, because you might be the only review or one of 3 or 4 or 5 in the States for a novel that really, really has guts. And then you do have a chance of actually helping it kind of get picked up, and moving things forward. So on the institutional front, I think for me it comes down to a lot of very calculated and deliberate practical decisions about where I spend my energy and my thinking, frankly. And the more existential or kind of deep intellectual plane, I think there's a lot of value to writing as a true local of a place. I think there's also a lot of value to learning what it means to be an insider from the position of an outsider, and having to go through that process and see with hopefully a completely open set of eyes and open heart what kinds of hurdles get thrown up that you might not be expecting. I tend to study, other than Russian, languages with relatively small first speaker populations. Afrikaans and Shona are both somewhere around 10 million. That's pretty conservative for Afrikaans. But right, first language speakers, my colleagues are all working on French and German and Spanish, and now Chinese. So it's a very, very different set of institutional circumstances that you navigate to work in those languages in South Africa or Zimbabwe or Ghana or wherever. And in doing that, you form very different relationships with people, and with the institutions where those languages are continuing to thrive and continuing to produce. So I think there's some amount of a warmth and a thoughtfulness built into it that isn't necessarily there if you are going for the big fish, right? that everybody else is doing.
I'm very struck by how the maritime language has kind of flowed into this conversation and has started to infuse it. And with that in mind, I wondered if we could move down to the very depth, to the abysmal zone of the ocean, so to speak. I can see Ashraf smiling over there. Both your books refuse transparency. Whether it's the Vanta Black of Black Portraiture or the dense interiority of the African philosopher figure. And, I can pull out numerous theorists from Glissant to Negrestani to Marachera's Black Sunlight, but all of them gesture towards this terrain. And I would love it if you could just speak a little bit about questions of visibility and legibility in both your works, and how and is there a politics or even a poetics to not being seen clearly, to remaining fugitive or unresolved?
Well, let me start with my dear beloved teacher, Homi Bhabha, who at 17 introduced me to his essay on mimicry. And that's the essay where he explains that the subaltern doesn't merely imitate power, but subverts it. So there's a dissimulation of connection, but then there's something else happening. So that's to do with not allowing yourself to be trapped in the violence of representation, as Glissant would argue in his essay on opacity. So why does opacity appeal to me? Why does the void appeal to me? Because it's where we actually live. Ideologues are dull. People who focus things in a very, very restrictive and controlling fashion, they are not human. They do not understand the complexities of what it means to be alive, because they've got programs or systems of order that they want to perpetrate at our expense. So the thing is, for me then, and one of my major issues I had to do long ago, I've been anti-Black portraiture for the last many years, because I see it as another variation of the slave trade. And I see it also as another way of commodifying Blackness. And it's curious, if you've been oppressed for 500 years, denied agency, denied a soul, denied a being, denied an identity, it might seem logical that you'd want to become somebody. And there are posters, classic posters which read, "I am somebody." But there's a treachery, because this is a humanist idea that's tied to the category of the individual. But the point is, if you've been stuck in that void for that long, why do you have to come out and basically imitate Western humanism, become another identity-fixated being? Why can't you just sort of lurk around in the depths? And find what is unnameable, what is not easy to categorize, which also seeps through and defines your being. So that is the thing that appeals to me most about writing, and also about the great art that I find. So there are good examples of this. There are figures like Amoako Boafo, for example, or Lynette Yadon-Boakye, both portraitists, who do something entirely different with the body, where you don't have, that moron, Kehinde Wiley, basically creating these self-entitled sort of beings that are so unutterably stupid and so unutterably dull and lifeless. These are people who create figures that are immanent, and that kind of immanence applies to all of us, irrespective of our age, our color, or our gender. And to be able to capture that energy, for me, it makes for greater painting. And so to hold on to that phenomenon, I think, is very, very important, because it's tied in many ways to what you're saying here, is that the importance of the fugitive and unresolved. It's not because this is a value we must maintain, but because we are inherently fugitive and unresolved. Where we ever thought, that, well, obviously the Cartesian cogito has a lot to answer for, as does the Socratic nonsense about knowing oneself. Both of these are illusions. Platonism is a disease, and everything since then is a corruption of that. But what we need to get to the pre-Socratics, to people like Heraclitus, to notions of flow and flux. And I do that, and I go through that all the way to the world that I grew up in the 80s and 70s with French philosophy, which does pretty much the same thing. Why? Because indeterminacy is healthy. I do understand, while I say this, I do understand the need, the craven need for an identity, a personhood, a sense of being. I do respect it, but I see it as one does from some dizzy height, with enormous patience and care and love, and a deep sense of sadness, all combined. There's a great movie by John Sayles called The Man Who Fell to Earth. Well, that's pretty much how I've felt my whole life.
Fantastic, thank you.
No, just I mean, we've been friends for a very, very long time. Is this on? But I so many of those words just send shivers down my intellectual spine. Void, flux, flow. As someone who was trained in the belly of the beast of high French theory at Yale, no, give me Plato and give me Socrates any day. On a serious note, I think it's part of what we've always had a lot of fun discussing and fighting about, and I'm the only one with wine right now, so I'll let you off the hook until later. I think there's a fundamental difference between what kind of language, what kind of critical language or descriptive language feels salient in regards to image, and what kind of critical language feels salient in regard to narrative. And to some degree, never the twain shall meet, right? Which is not to say that there aren't tons of people who do interesting work on art history and narrative and sort of the historiographic parallels. How would you narrate a void? People do it. They try. I typically hate those books. And even narrating consciousness, right? It's always contrived. It is always either more or less calculated about what it's doing, which word comes before which other. I mean, it's the basic difference between a metaphoric and a metonymic conception of meaning, and what makes meaning in the world. And I think in my deepest depths, I'm a narrative creature. I'm a fundamentally metonymic creature. And what had frustrated me in the years of training and conversation and oftentimes public-facing things and what editors wanted from me in magazines writing about Africa, was that there was this sense that aiming for cogency and oftentimes kind of written performance of argumentation somehow wasn't something that African writers had done and had been doing, frankly, since pre-print. Zimbabwe is a great example of this. That there wasn't a metonymic, fundamentally narrative impulse for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was about striving for clarity and organization in one's presentation of the world in a way that might be fundamentally different from how the world is actually experienced. And one of the things that I was distressed by in the States, and this is I don't do a lot of fighting words. I tend to be good and gendered and conflict averse. But one of the things that I will fight for is that the movement towards ontology and sort of rematerialization of race and blackness that happened in the U.S. Academy over the past maybe 10 years had some good things came of it, some good work came of it, as with any big critical movement, but also a lot of re-essentialization of Black writers and Black artists. And I think that that's quite unfortunate. And America has a lot to answer for in that regard. And so I write books about African Socratics. Right? The guy I just finished a book on, it's coming out in February, so it's one after this, felt very, very strongly that Fantis, which was his ethnic group, so the macro ethnicity would be Akan, A-K-A-N, and the one under that is the Fantis, that they were absolutely neck and neck, toe-to-toe with Greeks. And he has this long discursus, on Greek and Fanti reasoning and the way that it sort of comes together with certain ways of self-styling. And no one is ever going to tell me that that's not African. I mean, that's an absurd suggestion. So the void is there, and the void is African and human and everything else, but so is a powerful urge towards clarity and cogency and the organization of thought. And I think that's what writing is charged with in a way that perhaps the visual, right, as such, or the realm of the image has an easier time getting around.
Leads me beautifully into the next question, which I think will be as hotly debated, which is to talk a bit about abstraction. Ashraf's been terrorizing me by teasing me about this book, that this ginormous tome about abstraction that he's been working
almost
on,
done.
that seems to never materialize, and I'm getting worried has been swallowed into the biography. But there's something that in our conversations around abstraction, and when I read your work and your work in this book as well, is there's an approach to abstraction as a method that focuses on its generative power, particularly within artistic and philosophical context. So abstraction, not just a stylistic choice, but or a process of simplification, but as a dynamic and transformative approach. Jeanne-Marie, I see something similar in your thinking on the novel of ideas, where thought becomes a character and abstraction takes narrative forms to come back to narrative. Can you also speak a little bit about how you understand abstraction and how it functions in your work? It came up actually in the passage you read as well. Ashraf.
Yes, no, the book is not remotely being swallowed up into another book. I've got 4 more chapters to write in that one. The book in abstraction has a title that comes from A.R. Ammond's poem, Corson's Inlet, which is my favorite poem. And the opening line is, "I went for a walk along the dunes again this morning." That's the title of the book. So what it's about then is about the idea of perambulation, of movement, of flow, of flux. But the idea of the habitual and the return to things that we need to do, what we were talking about earlier in terms of walking. But the thing is, it's about meditation. And meditation is a way of moving against the violence of representation, where narrative becomes something that becomes overly dogmatic, where it's defined too much by received opinion. And you need to allow room for things which don't work or work differently, which are unsaid. Now, I've just today rewatched Pride and Prejudice, Joe Wright's Pride and Prejudice, for the 25th time. And it's on at the moment at the movies. So the last 3 days, I could see it on the big screen twice. Now, the reason I bring that up, the words pride and prejudice, they're all imperatives, and they're in conflicts. Projected ideas of who you think somebody is not what a person is. So the point is the nominal can inhibit and contain and disrupt the greater connections that allow people to understand and feel and connect. As my other favorite, Ian Forster, in Howard's End says, only connect the prose and the passion, and we will be exalted, and we will no longer live in fragments. So the idea of connection is also something that is synergetic, synthetic, but it's not dialectical, because no connections can actually work coherently. The real connections actually work beyond sense, beyond logic, to what it is we call love, or what it is we call desire, what it is that drives, connects people. We don't know what it is, but it's there and it binds us. Now, in terms of narrative in this regard, to pick up on Jeanne-Marie, I mean, a writer that I'm utterly in love with and have been in love with for decades is Michael Ondaatje. Now, the thing is, there's a writer who writes fiction, but what happens in the moment of writing is that, there's a wonderful sort of dissolution of all the conditions and forms that you make sense, and to connect strangers and strangenesses to each other, to create new parities, and that's what I find exciting about that kind of experimental writing. For me, I'm not ruling against what Jeanne-Marie said about the Socratics, but I just finished writing an essay for a German exhibition on Kentridge, and I basically explained that Kentridge is a sophist, because basically if you look at all his major thinking, all his major thoughts about himself, nothing is fixed. Everything actually just works in this sort of quagmire, and that comes from the history of sophistry, which rationalists condemn and treat as untrustworthy because it will not take a stand. But not taking a stand is also the position that a very political person like Edward Said will also say he is a pes optimist. So even though he will fight for the rights of the Palestinian, he'll at the same time, when he's working as a humanist, he realizes that things have to somehow vacillate. They can't be deterministic. And right now in the world that we're living in, which is a world defined by fanaticism, fundamentalism, and fascism, how do we free ourselves from these tyrannies? We can't free ourselves from these tyrannies by opening and setting up a new set of absolutes. We've got to basically be like the Intifada. We've got to throw a stone and run. This is actually from Said. So the whole idea through deflection, through engagement and deflection, do we come at a new way, a new warfare, a new way of living, a new kind of freedom. Michael Hare also says this in his book on Vietnam in the Dispatches. He says, talking about fighting in the Vietnam War is not fighting the trenches in the First and Second World War, which is like high noon. Bad guy, good guy. It doesn't work like that, because basically in a jungle, it's 360 degrees. You can't orient yourself. You can't see the enemy. The enemy's in front of you, behind you, on the side of you. So it's with this reality of this world where we're basically being parasited and attacked at every corner. You can't just stand there as a definable being and aggress against something. That's not the way you're going to free yourself. So what I'm saying is the power of sophistry today is that it frees us from the burden of history, the tyranny of history, and the dogma of the current moment.
God, I'm boring compared to Ashraf. So I said, God, I'm boring compared to Ashraf. That's why I love you. I have a very close friend who I'm sure some of you will know and admire as much as I do. Her name is Henrietta Rose Innes. She's, I think, one of your best writers in English. And she said to me once, I don't know, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, something, that the hardest part of writing a novel for her was figuring out how the hell she was going to get a person from one place to another. Just boring AF, as my students would say, right? Like, I know they're in Cape Town and they're going to go to some, it's Henrietta, so some abandoned, weird, toxic gas station somewhere with, covered in squirrels or dossies or whatever. How am I going to do it? And it's always stuck with me as a defining principle of novel writing, if we're talking about novels that are anywhere near the terrain of the real, right, of realist, if we're not talking about sort of, Michael Lenz and German high experimental fiction or whatever. And I think that my interest in abstraction is actually, in a real way, aligned with this problem of how am I going to get a character from one place to another. It's mechanical, it's operational. Abstraction is something that people do. All of us do it. People who study, kind of cognitive psychology don't see abstraction as rarefied or snobby, or some mark that you've had extensive philosophical training, right? The way that it's often been treated, frankly, in talking about the post-colonial novel. Abstraction is just a kind of basic part of being a human functioning in the world. And so my goal with the last book I wrote, and to some degree the one that's coming out, was to show how writers, and that level of remove is very important to me, how they figured that out, what it looked like for people to do abstraction, to abstract, not to be abstract, I think. And again, that's where I just become this really doggedly narrative kind of person, for better or for worse. So what does it look like for someone in one situation or another one to abstract, to, again, pull up at a little bit of remove with knowledge that they're doing that. It's not this kind of grand claim that somehow you can occupy an asocial, right, apolitical position. That's, I think, a very lazy charge, frankly, and very inhuman. It's to ask what happens when people try to take that space, and they are ineluctably still in the world while they're doing it, and in a particular world and in a particular set of settings and concerns. So abstraction for me is something that one does. And I had felt for a very long time that all of the African writers, politicians, right, people who have lived in this part of the world and done it as much as anyone else had really been given short shrift. And that was the very modest goal I set for myself, was sort of attending to that. In many ways, anti-visual because it requires the elapsing of time to show how it's working.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're running out of time very, very fast. So I would like to kind of end it there and hand it over to any questions from the floor. Yes. Yes, please stand so we can see you. It'd be great.
I think in most of our conversations, Ashraf, we usually have this agreement about that void, right? And this disdain for portraiture, like the simplicity of what Black African art has kind of become. But in this conversation, like I'm looking around and I'm thinking like, even in these conversations, like part of what drives our connection over that is like ideas about, look, I guess you don't say this, but I would look at it from like Black death or social death, necropolitics, like these ideas that Black thinkers have put out to say, like you're saying, the world doesn't see you as real, so you might as well operate in this negative space. That's where we bring it from, right? But looking around the room, it's kind of like I'm asking myself this question of like, who's talking about this, right? Who's talking about African art and African history and blackness? And is that maybe somewhat like a reenactment of this space of social death and dead spaces of politics, where the Black person or the African person is being spoken for, and being told what blackness and Africanness is, and being sort of digested and understood and written about. So I'm just curious to hear from the panel, like, what is the leap there, like from the history of Africans and Black people being written about and digested and consumed, and what we're doing now in this room. Like, I'd like to sort of hear that shift.
Sure. Well, firstly, I'm a huge admirer of Ashila Mbembe, but I have absolute contempt for necrophilia. What I mean for our necropolitics and the idea of pathology as the defining condition of being. I believe it's deeply nihilistic. It's tied obviously to the death instinct, and it's deeply tied to the complete aberrant construction of blackness, but then the internalization of that wound, and then the perpetuation of that wound. And rather in the same way as the maid in the second half of Ingmar Bergman's Fanny Alexander, what she does is she has a wound in her palm. It heals, she scratches it, it suppurates, it heals, she scratches, it suppurates. So that kind of pathological return, or what Becker would call habit as a dog chained to its vomit, is that level of kind of pathological reversion to one's own pain, or one's own failing, or one's own suffering, and then the objectification, the manifestation of that, I have almost zero patience for, and I never have found it interesting, I haven't found it liberating, I haven't found it worth writing about. Because why? Take an example, you mentioned Dambadzo Marichera, a great, great writer, who learned, this might be apocryphal, but he learned to write while scrubbing around on a dump site, going through old remained newspapers, etc. But there's a certain kind of the black sunlight, so the clear idea is, how do you bring in and connect the darkness, the pathology, to something that is enabling? Is if you cannot do that, just slit your wrists. I'm sorry. I'm not a very compassionate person when it comes to failing. Because for me, the whole thing about life is to be enabling and inspiring and to grow people and make them stronger and stronger and stronger. And that, I think, is what we need to do. So the idea of Black Death, interesting now, for example, if you think about your generation, actually, Heidi, and that toxic word which is everywhere at the moment, the affective, the affect, which is basically the internalization, the subjectification of your own suffering. Boy, is that dull. But it's seen to be a legitimate form of expression. and a right to one's own being. But there's no true access to that point. It's not your own being, and it's an attitudinal construction of your suffering or your right or your call to justice that is manifested in that space. If you look at it another, you mentioned, the whole history of colonialism. Colonialism has never just been about the abandonment or the abuse or the desecration of the other. Because, of course, if you read your Hegel correctly, not the Hegel that Hegel thought he was writing, but the one that basically makes you realize the master and the slave are inextricably bound. There's no way it's one space that is a space of suffering and the other space is exempt. It's never been like that. It simplifies the history of bondage and of subjugation and of power. So we need to find more complex ways of understanding power, more liberating ways of dealing with one's own sort of disaffections and pain, and grow. And I think about my other dear friend, Kay Selodeka, who wrote a great novel, The Quiet Violence of Dreams, where basically you look at that book, it's going through the night, but it comes out into space that is so splendid, so empowering. So in the midst of suffering, there is something else going on that is good and strong and potent. So I would want to hold onto all of that, and that's the key thing. I think my last class teaching at CPUT, after many years like academics, we spend all our lives annotating and nobody pays attention to the annotations and the same mistakes get repeated and repeated and repeated. So finally, my last day, in my last sentence, I said, you know what, to my class body, you write as badly as you fuck. No subject, no object, no denouement, no climax. It's basically, it's just the complete, so that kind of total desecration of syntax, of narrative, of growth, of development, of being, and we have a radical nullification of that at the moment. So in this space, what do we have in its space? We have a kind of a hysterical, spasmodic kind of cry for help from people who are actually making no true effort to help themselves. This is what I'm saying. I'm not a caregiver. I'm not a socialist. I can't handle that level of darkness in my life at all.
Yeah, do a little ballet routine or something. Yeah, it's always the elephant in the room. I think that there are a couple important points that aren't very sexy, aren't very glamorous or exciting that often go missing because they do feel academic. One of which is that there's a very big difference between being trained to study a textual tradition and being trained as an anthropologist or as a sociologist, or as a kind of scholar or writer that is working with people, right? I am very much not an anthropologist or a sociologist, or someone who is trained, and there are people who do very, very well at it, and people who do stuff extremely problematically. The history of anthropology, it's its own. Cyrilla could tell us much more about that. What I'm trained to do and what I'm deeply committed to doing is making sense of how people have formally made sense of themselves. And I think that there is sometimes a risk of getting to a place where somehow colonized parts of the world, which is a lot of the world, right? Not just Africa, a whole lot of the fucking world. But Africa kind of comes up, for particular passion here for obvious reasons, and the way that its racial vocabularies have often not always coalesced with that of the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. Where that's the place, or those are the places where you cannot study the texts and the formal ways in which people have made sense of themselves. And that, to me, especially coming from a rich elite institution in America, is really dangerous. I've had students come and sit in my class, and not so much now because now we're fascist, you may have heard. caught wind. That is true, right? But over the past decade or so, students who are from all different parts of the world, so South Asian students in my class, and East Asian students in my class, and American students, and Caribbean students, and African students from Africa, and first-gen African students who have never been to the continent. It's an extremely international student body, extremely international, where they would come and sort of be worried, oh, well, if I'm going to read Marichera, who I often teach, then I have to kind of be deep in Zimbabwean, understanding of custom and culture. I mean, obviously, you want to be teaching people where things are from, and not let them sort of short circuit the connection between history and politics and text. But I'll be damned if I'm going to be in a position where I'm teaching British and French novels as texts, and somehow novels from here are only valuable, right, as kind of pieces of a racial political archive. And I think anyone doing work seriously and honestly, dealing with these issues, working across lines of race, working across lines of academy and institution, should just be talking about this essentially all the time, and figuring out where your seesaw best comes to rest, if you will, in a given situation. And how I navigate it at a huge conference is very different than how I would navigate it in an introductory class for freshmen who know virtually nothing about anything, is very different than how I would talk to a graduate student who is interested in doing really rigorous comparative work between, I have a student right now working on sort of Emirati literature and African literature in English and French and Arabic. So there's a lot there, and I think it's very difficult to answer a question like that well outside of a situation.
Thank you so much, both. Any other last questions? Maybe let me close it because we are running out of time. I think we have already run out of time. But maybe just one very last for a quick answer. These are books that I think are, you expect to find in the university or maybe on the coffee table. Or tell me where your book where you think your books would most like to be read. Well, that's the cliche of where art books are, is it not? So I want you to come against that cliche or enforce that cliche if you'd like to. Where is the very best place to all the buyers here who are going to rush to buy your books after this? Where should they be read?
Where should they be read? My God. In a bathtub with a glass of wine. Thinking about abstraction, right, as mechanics before you pass out and realize that you should really be reading ton of French probably the next day.
Well, for me, it'll definitely be in bed with your electric blanket on.
Okay, I'd like to close it there. Thank you very much to the everybody. I think we could have talked all night, but